Welcome back. As we're thinking about how we can design effective interview questions, it's a good idea to develop some templates to help us ensure we're getting good information. But before you get too focused on the role that you're going to play in the process, let me just remind you that the best interviewers are not the people who simply ask the right questions. They're the ones who ask good questions with an understanding of how those questions will open up opportunities to listen and direct the interview in the right way. And I think here it's good to pause for a moment and tell you the story of a man named Dale Carnegie, who wrote a very popular book about 100 years ago called How to Win Friends and Influence People. Now, you might know that today Carnegie's name is heavily associated with the self-help industry, and the Carnegie Institute he founded is one of the major names in helping individuals and corporate employees in working on their soft skills training. But what you might not know is his story and how Carnegie developed these techniques, because he himself was discontent with just about every other card life had dealt him, including, by the way, his last name, which was pronounced the same, Carnegie, but spelled differently, and he changed that name to make it more recognizable so that people would trust him. When Dale Carnegie was starting out growing up in Missouri, he realized his options were pretty limited. He hated the farm work that he had to do with his parents, and he had no athletic ability. He decided to become a member of the school debate club, and he became obsessed with becoming a great public speaker. And this led him to an early career in sales, and ultimately a desire to be in the theater as a raconteur, reciting famous poems and stories. But he just didn't have the talent for acting required to get into that career field, and he had to fall back on his greatest skill, speaking in public, to develop a course for the YMCA to help people to learn how to become better at building good public speaking personas. Part of what made him successful was that he was an excellent listener. He could get people to open up without feeling judged. He could zero in on what was holding people back from being effective, and he could help them to articulate their own success plan. Before writing his book, he never worked in an office or as a manager, but he was heralded as an expert in corporate success. If you read through Carnegie's book, and I would suggest you should, but I definitely qualify it by saying it's a bit outdated and not entirely practical a century later, he offers many rules which are still really helpful for anyone who plans to make a career out of speaking to other people, whether it is in a public speaking context or more informally, like in meetings. Some of the best advice he offers is to make things easy for the other person to open up. Smile sincerely, he says, and if you can't make yourself do so, do something that's going to make you feel good, like hum a happy little tune or think of a pleasant memory. Don't just feign a positive attitude, he says, really have one. And then he offers this great advice that any interviewer should take to heart. If you aspire to be a good conversationalist, be an attentive listener. To be interesting, be interested. Ask questions that other persons will enjoy answering. Encourage them to talk about themselves and their accomplishments. Remember that the people you are talking to are 100 times more interested in themselves and their wants and problems than they are in you and your problems. One of the ways that we can show that we're interested is to ask questions that have a logical flow to them, which encourages our subjects to open up and share their perspectives. We don't want to just assault people with a bunch of questions, so we need to divide our questions up into lines of questioning, which are connected in some kind of logical way. And we also need to take some time to think about how people will respond to questions, so we're taking them down a path that feels natural and interesting to them. Begin with a few warm-up questions that are easy to answer and which are personal in order to establish rapport. It's normal to ask people to talk about themselves or share some information about their families or perhaps offer an interesting fact about their lives. There's actually, though, some debate about whether or not these questions are needed in a qualitative interview, since they eat up time and they don't generate much in the way of useful data. And one general guideline would be that if an interview subject is already comfortable, these sorts of questions can be skipped. But I would actually say it's better practice to use warm-up questions for priming participants to start thinking about the topic at hand. For example, if you're going to be talking about vacation destinations, instead of asking softball questions that are entirely unrelated to your study, ask them about their favorite trip and have them tell you a little bit about themselves during that initial story that they tell you. If you're going to ask them to taste test a product, ask them to tell you about their favorite foods and get them engaged in talking about foods so that they'll be a little bit better able in the taste test to articulate what they like. Use these lines of questioning to help your participants get used to the flow of the conversation that you're going to direct. This is a great opportunity to not only get to know them, but also to help them be prepared for the harder questions that you're going to ask next. Once you get started, it's conventional to use one of a few types of structures to ask questions. One approach is to focus on perceptual questions where you ask participants to explain what they think about something. Another approach is to focus on behavioral questions where you ask participants to explain a specific experience or a set of actions they've undertaken. Another is to focus on situational questions where you ask participants to respond to a hypothetical scenario, or maybe to talk about something where they can apply an experience they had in the past to a very similar scenario that may occur in the future. Yet another is to produce or introduce an exercise or a stimulus response, and many interviews also make use of filtering or profiling questions, often using a yes-no structure or other close-ended approach that can help to reduce asking questions that are inappropriate for a particular participant. For example, did you have experience with this service? If they say yes, you ask them some questions. If they say no, you move on. Most interviewers use a combination of the above structures, and it's common to see interviews start with some perceptual questions before going on to more difficult lines of questioning, and then maybe to close out with a few additional perceptual questions. Remember, perceptual questions are asking people what they think and feel, so they're usually pretty easy questions to start and end with. Often, interview guides are constructed in several sections that are introduced with some transition text and which have a specific flow that's designed to create a feeling of escalating difficulty, followed by a feeling of relief and ease before the questions get difficult again. So you want to have this kind of cycle of tension and release, just like a heartbeat. That's a really natural rhythm, a natural flow, and it helps people, as things get more difficult, to then feel relaxed before things get more difficult again. Of course, the order in which questions are asked is really important as well. And one point that I'd offer is to be mindful of the participants' ability to recall fine details. Often, interviews structured around perceptual or behavioral questions are looking for really precise details, so it's important to recognize that memory is associative and tends to require taking participants down a process to trigger specific ideas. Constructing a survey about customer experience, for example, is often best done by talking about top-of-mind perceptual details, then walking participants through a behavioral line of questioning structured around process touch points, and then maybe offering either perceptual or situational lines of questioning as a drill down on areas of specific interest. Once you've introduced some memories, it's easier to get people to draw upon them to answer additional questions. But one thing that you also need to be mindful of is that participants want to stay consistent with what they've told you earlier in an interview much of the time, and this tendency results in something known as an order effect. Let's say you ask someone early in a survey to express how satisfied they are with a service overall, and then they ask you many questions about specific aspects of that service. Their initial answer will be like a flag that they planted in the ground, and they'll answer every following question with what they told you first in mind. And if they told you, for example, that service stinks, they're going to be more likely to stick with that theme and find fault with many of the other aspects that you're going to bring up afterwards. If they told you, on the other hand, that service was great, they'll be more likely to find reasons why even an aberrant experience isn't so bad. But here's where things get really tricky. Let's say instead of asking them to plant that flag in their overall experience first, you instead go through the touch points and then ask them to give their overall assessment at the end. And what you're going to find is that their answer is going to change to be consistent with how they talked about the touch points. If the initial part of the service was really good, and it's the middle or the end that really stinks for most people, offering positive feedback as they describe the beginning of the process may prevent them from explaining their more negative feedback later in quite the same terms because their initial flag has been planted on the positive side of things. This can provide very different sets of data to explore. And I'm not even saying the data are better or worse necessarily. They're just different due to the impact of order effects. So you have to be really careful. And it's important to be aware of how order effects might impact your interview guide. And one best practice I would recommend is to test variations of your lines of questioning using a pilot test before you launch your study so that you can be aware of where those order effects might be present. It's also good to think about how you word your questions. While there are many schools of thought on how to do this best, I find human resources literature is very handy since HR interviews are often trying to get job candidates to provide detailed information about themselves. The United States Office of Personnel Management has a handy guide for wording questions for structured human resources interviews, and they advise things like keeping questions open-ended, which means avoiding choice alternatives or yes/no answers unless you're profiling or creating filters. Also being clear and concise, avoiding jargon, wording questions at an appropriate reading level for your participants to be able to understand. Providing context for questions whenever possible so that the questions just aren't out of the blue, that they have a concrete understanding of what it is you're trying to ask. And then also using the STAR method for behavioral or situational questions, and that should elicit either the situation or task that you're talking about, the action that your participant is going to articulate, and then the result that they think is going to come out of the action that they specified. Ultimately, writing good interview guides boils down to having a keen sense of how human beings respond to questions. So something else I'd recommend is listening critically to interviews and paying attention to how skilled interviewers get others to open up and share good information. One of the most uncomfortable experiences you could ever have as a marketing researcher is to be stuck in a room with someone who is not responding to your questions and who's not giving you useful information. It's not only awkward, it's also embarrassing and frustrating, and it can erode your confidence and your client or research team's confidence in the entire research process. Take your lines of questioning and be sure to test your questions out with an ear for what you're getting from your participants. It's worth the time and the trouble. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about some good interviewing habits you can develop to ensure your lines of questioning get the best possible information.